south of the border, down Mexico way. That's where I fell in love when the stars above came out to play. And now as I wander...
Hello there, all you expat wannabes. I'm Johnny Mueller, and you're listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America, the show that tells you just what it's like to live, work, play, and or retire down here in Latin America. It's a mix of the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, and it's all right here, so let's get started.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the Cov-idiot scare and the lockdown insanity. The testing, the fear, the quarantines, etc. You know, it seems to me the only good thing that came out of this Cov-idiot stuff is that grandmas all over the world have learned to use the internet. Finally, the old gray-haired crowd doesn't have to lean on the younger set to help them maneuver through the Amazon website. I mean, look, how many times have you been in a conversation with your old gray-haired grandmother? You told her about something on the internet, and you knew you'd have to do the legwork to get her to see it or find it. Thanks to the lockdowns, those days are gone. Speaking of lockdowns, quarantines, and such, here's some good news that's coming out of Guatemala. And since my Expat Insider Seminar starts in about a month, I hope the following comes to pass. I'm reading from an article now that just came out yesterday on a Latin American business news site, and I'll translate here. It says, Guatemalan Airline Association requests to eliminate entry negative COVID test requirements. It starts by saying, in order to reduce the complications of travel and additional costs, the Guatemalan Airline Association asked the Ministry of Health authorities to no longer require passengers to take a negative COVID-19 test to enter the country. Then it says, according to a Ministry of Health document called National Guidelines for the Prevention of COVID-19 for International Travel, which has been in effect since September 15, 2020, all travelers arriving in Guatemala must present a negative COVID-19 test. Then it says, with this new Guatemalan Airline Association request, representatives in a statement said the requirement has lost its validity since both the World Health Organization, WHO, and the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, have stated with their recommendations, when there's a presence of a pandemic in any country, it's not logical to ask for a PCR test anymore because the virus has already been established and has worked its way through the population, thus making PCR tests redundant. Then it says, Mati Rodas, executive director of the Guatemalan Airline Association, told in a statement to the Prensa Libre, Guatemala's largest newspaper, that there was a verbal request just submitted to the health authorities to eliminate the test completely, because it's just another cost and an obstacle to tourism, which has been hit hard by COVID-19. Then we've got a quote from Ronnie Rodriguez, director of affairs for Volaris Airlines, that goes in and out of Guatemala. He says, the problem currently is that there's an additional cost that must be assumed by passengers for the COVID PCR test, which represents an outlay between $50 and $150, depending on the airline. And just the cost itself is a detriment to tourist travelers. All right, there you have it. And this request, by the way, was sent to the Guatemalan Ministry of Health, who makes those rules, on December 1st. So even with mañana time in the holiday season here, so I guess it's double mañana time, that we'll have an answer in a couple days anyway. And the odds are good, and people have been saying those restrictions will be lifted since Mexico, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Brazil have already loosened up their Cov-idiot entrance rules with no PCR test required. So let's see how that shakes out. It would be good news, wouldn't it? I'll definitely keep you posted. All right, then staying with the healthcare or healthcare problem theme, we've got a nicely detailed boots-on-the-ground story that just came in. And though it's something you don't want to think about, and it's the reason people have healthcare insurance, at least gringos and expats do, you have to wonder sometimes what would happen if you're in the third world, out in the campo, let's say, out in the boonies. It's nighttime, after hours. You're not at home. You're not familiar with the local hospitals, doctors, or clinics. What would it be like? What would you do? What could go wrong, especially if your Spanish sucks? If you had an accident or medical emergency. So do listen closely to this boots-on-the-ground story because it could happen to you, so pay attention. This comes from Mr. R, who's in Antigua, Guatemala right now. And I'll paraphrase this as usual, cut out the boring parts. Says, hey, Johnny, I got a boots-on-the-ground story for you that I think is really worth sharing. But first off, what the did you play on your podcast the other day? I've never heard you play any music at all, so the first time you settle on a reggaeton or whatever it is tune, All right, enough about giving you crap on the music thing, and on to my story. Whoa, Nelly. Wait a minute. Before we get into that, Mr. R, apparently you didn't listen very closely to my lead-in before I played that 20-second music clip, or what very loosely might be called music. I was trying to demonstrate, for one, how English words often get shoved into Spanish phrases, and how at first they get lost in translation and Latinos don't know what these guys are talking about, but eventually that English word or phrase becomes the flavor of the month and every Latino picks up on it. And suddenly you're hearing it everywhere. And in the case of that clip I played, the title of that song was Weed in el Casco. That's weed being marijuana. Everybody knows what that is in English. But here in Latin America, weed is a new phrase that, because of the song, has caught on. So then what does it mean in that song? Well, weed in el Casco means weed that's been hidden in the helmet of a motorcyclist. And it's a motorcyclist telling a story of being pulled over by a cop when he's got his weed in his helmet. In other words, that's where motorcyclists will hide their weed in case they happen to get pulled over by the cops. Because, even if their bike gets searched, if you're a local, the cops might shake you down. Not if you're a gringo, but if you're a local or a motorcyclist. Well, a motorcyclist will leave his helmet on, rightfully thinking a cop will never stick his hand in it or mess with it. Well, they will now because everybody knows about it. Anyway, on to the really interesting part of Mr. R's email. He says, Johnny, a few weeks ago I was pondering what would happen if my wife or I needed real emergency care, being that we're here in Guatemala right now. How would we navigate that process, and how would we get to where we're supposed to go? My insurance guy told me to call him whenever an emergency happened, and he'd arrange it all. My Latin American insurance guy, that is. I have a Latin American private healthcare insurance plan. But what if he doesn't answer at 2 a.m. in the morning? Well, let's just say I recently found out. So here's the setup. It's Thanksgiving night in Antigua, Guatemala, just a week or so ago. There was a party, and 5 of us were walking down a dark trail to get to our restaurant with only the light in our cell phones illuminating the way. So when I say it's a dark trail to the restaurant, it should also cue you in that the trail is not going to be paved, as per many Latin American roads, but it does have some rudimentary stairs, if you can call them that. Of course, all on par per Latin American standards. So as we're walking down to the restaurant, one of the people in our party slipped and fell. As I approached her to help her up, I immediately saw her ankle and told her not to get up. It was clearly broken. Happy Thanksgiving, huh? So one of us quickly went down to the restaurant to use their phone and call for help. And after about 15 minutes later, the bomberos were on the scene. Bomberos are firemen. They stabilized her leg with a tree branch. Yep. Holy Grizzly Adams, Batman. A good old 100% natural, organic, non-GMO, gluten-free tree branch. Found everywhere, cheap as dirt, in fact free. That is, an ultra old-school trick that'll work in a pinch. Of course, you need bandages too, and the bomberos were well supplied. So the men in our party and the bomberos and some others who just wanted to help all took turns carrying the woman up the trail, probably about 150 yards or so uphill. All right, let's stop for a second. Bomberos, the Latin word for firemen. Yep, every little town and nook and cranny city has a bombero station. Sometimes they got pretty good equipment too, because it's mostly donated from the first world. Though they've got a lot of rustic antiques on hand too. Anyway, then Mr. R says the bomberos then loaded her on a stretcher and lifted her onto the ambulance and took her to one of the private hospitals in the area called Santiago Apostol Hotecanango. Talk about lost in translation. One more thing, Johnny. It was our request to take her to a private hospital, never to a national public hospital. That much we all know. Oh yeah, did I mention she did not have insurance? Someone from our party rode in the ambulance and reported that all the typical ambulance things, the blood pressure machine, the cuffs, the usual suspect ambulance stuff, appeared to be, well, not too functional. Now here's the thing. The bomberos did not ask for any payment, but we tipped them anyway for the ambulance ride. And it's important to note that they themselves are not getting paid by any government or private entity, but work solely on donations. Maybe it's the same thing for the ambulance equipment, too. All right, me, Johnny, here. When you see one of those bombero stations, it sometimes says on the big sign out front, Bomberos Voluntarios, instead of just bomberos. That means voluntary firemen. All right then, Mr. R says. So next, we got to the hospital probably around 9 p.m. And the attending doctor put her in a room and awaited for the x-ray techs to show up before they would give an official diagnosis and treatment. But we all knew what it was. It was obvious. Once the x-rays confirmed the obvious, there was talk of surgery and putting screws and plates in her ankle. That's when I immediately called my insurance broker and told him what happened. Yeah, he picked up the phone all right. And his immediate and direct answer was, do not under any circumstances let them put screws or plates in her ankles there. Get her to a hospital in the capital city, Guatemala City, which confirmed what I've been told by some of the people I know in my circles down here. We are told to use those little hospitals around the country to patch up minor stuff, but to get to the capital city for any real big treatment. And also note the doctor at the small hospital did not give her anything for pain till about 2 hours after the injury, and only after someone asked if she could have something for it. Then he kind of looked surprised that we'd even asked that question. So in the end, the pain meds, x-rays, diagnosis, and cast turned out to be about $120. Remember, no insurance. Had we stayed there, the costs for the surgery and the metal plates and all that would have been around $1,250. That was the estimate. Now, I'm sure, Johnny, they're well versed in these small hospitals on broken bones and stuff, but we had the means and were able to take her to the hospital of our choice in the big city. All right, meet Johnny here again. You know, if you're in Antigua, Guatemala, and you have to go to Guatemala City at that time of night, it's probably like a half-hour drive. During the day, probably an hour or so. Oh, and note that Antigua, Guatemala has around 30 to 40,000 people, and the big city, Guatemala City, has 2 million or so, so it is a big city. That's why I always say if you live in or around or near Guatemala City, you don't want for anything. They've got it all, including a dozen or so very good first world style hospitals. So then Mr. R says it was around 10 p.m. when they made the decision to get her to the city. And after some consideration and discussion, we settled on her going to Hospital Centro Medico. It's one of the more well-known private first world hospitals in a pretty nice section of town. Turns out the injured lady had been at that hospital before and had a good experience, so she said, let's do it. Wait a minute. Me, Johnny, here again. I'm kind of wondering if that lady Gringo who broke her ankle, and she knows about Central Medical Hospital and has been in Antigua and in and around Guatemala, sounds like for a long time. Why, if she's been spending a lot of time in Guatemala, she doesn't have an insurance plan? They're so damn cheap and have such great coverage. Doesn't make sense, especially if you have an injury like that. If you have to pay a couple of grand out of your pocket, that's a couple of years' premiums you could have paid for a very good insurance plan. I don't get it, but, you know, there's lots of things I don't get. All right, Mr. R continues. So we phoned up the bomberos again, but this time they asked or required a $45 donation fee since they were taking someone outside of their jurisdiction, and as mentioned, it would take at least a half hour to get there. So we followed the ambulance and arrived at Centro Medico without incident. All right, me, Johnny, here again. Just a note. That Hospital Centro Medico is the one my friend, the Gringo guy from New York who owns a bunch of clothing maquilas here in Guatemala. He swears by that hospital. He's been there many times, and his workers too. You know, workers do get injured. And he's got, I think, a couple hundred workers. Just a little plug for that hospital. I've been in it, but I've never used it myself. I use another one. The same one I take my Expat Insiders seminar people to for our tour. But as mentioned, there are at least a dozen really good first world style hospitals in Guatemala City. So you got lots of options. And they've all got a number of satellite clinics too. All right, then Mr. R continues by saying, Johnny, upon arrival at Centro Medico, the emergency room had only us and another party there. It was clean and modern, first world all the way, except for one thing. It was empty. Think about that. Even in the age of COVID, when you hear the media propaganda about overflowing hospitals, it was empty. They took the injured lady to a room and began with all the IVs and meds. In order to fully admit her, the hospital required an upfront charge or retainer of sorts, $4,000. I'm not sure how they figured that amount. Maybe it's just an estimated percentage of a typical similar surgery. Who knows? Anyway, that retainer was paid to get them moving along. The admissions people said if they needed more, they'd let us know. So far, so good. So she had the surgery. It went well. She had 2 plates and numerous screws placed in and around her ankle and is projected to fully heal in about 3 months. Since she lived in the U.S. for about 40 years, her opinion of the hospital was nothing but complimentary. The staff, the docs, the room, even the food was excellent. Come on, Johnny, since when does anyone compliment hospital food? Though she didn't comment or say if it was better or worse than the U.S., only that it was first class all the way. So she left and was back home the following Saturday. In closing, Johnny, do you care to guess what the full final bill was? Before it was fully calculated, my Latin American insurance guy guessed it would be around 10 grand. And another hospital I called just to check made a guess of around 12 grand. Of course, neither knew the exact details of the surgery. They were just making educated guesses. The final tally, $5,300. Not sure if that's a good deal or not. I tried researching the costs of ankle surgeries in the U.S., but it was too confusing to try to decipher the charges and add up the average cost. Maybe you can elaborate or a listener can chime in. Now, had she had the typical Latin American 80-20 insurance, like my wife and I have, I figure the final out-of-pocket bill for her would have been around $1,300 or so. So there you have it, Johnny. Now I and you and your listeners know the process of procuring medical care in an emergency in Guatemala, Central America. A true, recent, boots-on-the-ground story. Signed, Mr. R. Well, Mr. R, thanks for that. Very interesting, and I do have some numbers for you. If you recall, in a past life, I was an electrical engineer and double majored in biomedical engineering. So I made a few inquiries to some of my in-the-know buddies. They sent me to a website, a U.S. website called costhelperhealth.com, which, by the way, breaks down the cost for all kinds of surgeries you can think of. And here's how it would break down if you had that stuff done at a typical hospital in the U.S. Without health insurance, it says the surgical treatment of a broken leg or ankle typically costs between $17,000 and $35,000. However, if it's a complicated fracture involving pins and plates, it will cost around $33,500, not including the typical surgeon's fee of around $2,000 to $3,000. That, according to the Orthopedic Surgery Association. And if a person enters the hospital via the emergency room, that fee will add another $2,000 to the bill. So in the end, without insurance in the States, a procedure like that runs approximately 40 grand. But that's not all. It says for patients who have had broken leg or ankle bones treated surgically and metal hardware placed, sometimes it's left in permanently. But when it's removed, that'll cost between $2,500 and $11,000 more. That, according to the California Orthopedic Institute. So in the U.S., best case, 30 grand, worst case, around 50 grand. So if we take even the best case, 30 grand, and the true cost incurred here in Guatemala, our lady ankle fracture patient paid 1/6 the amount she would have paid if she'd have had the work done in an average U.S. hospital. And worst case, if it would have cost her 50 grand going through an emergency room in the States and having her metal plates and screws removed at some later date. Then, after doing the numbers, dividing 5 grand into 50, after having the work done in a Guatemala hospital, she'd end up paying 1/10 of the U.S. cost. You know, that pretty much jives with everything I've been saying all along, all these years, about the cost of medical care here in Latin America at private first world style hospitals. You long-time listeners have heard me say this 100 times. Down here, especially off the Gringo tourist trail, you pay about a fifth or less for practically any medical treatment here, including hospitalizations and surgery, compared to what you'd pay for the same thing up in the States. By the way, when you come to my Expat Insider Seminar, we spend at least 4 hours talking about insurance companies, insurance plans, doctors, hospitals, ambulance services, the works. Plus, I go over actual plans for gringos and expats that I've translated into English. You know, you buy a plan here in Latin America, it's going to be in Spanish. So I have plowed through a number of these plans and have translated them. And after the seminar is over, I give you a download of at least 100 of my reports, including those insurance plans in English. But, you know, since Mr. R in his boots-on-the-ground example mentioned bomberos, using them as an ambulance service, sure, that's possible. There's bomberos everywhere throughout Latin America, and they'll come fast. But, you know, if you have an actual insurance plan, an ambulance will come instead of the bomberos. There are some excellent private ambulance services. And when you need them, you just dial up their speed number, like a 911 number. And, of course, depending where you are, if you're in the city, for example, they'll be there within 10 minutes. However, if you're way out in the boonies, it just depends. They'll get there, but just like anywhere in the world, the closer you are to a big city, the quicker the ambulances will arrive. So it's good to know when you buy private insurance, they're affiliated with certain ambulance companies that'll pick you up when you need them, and they'll take you to the hospital of your choice. For example, there's a private ambulance service that has coverage in something like 15 out of the 20 Latin American countries. It's called Alerta Medica. And a lot of the good insurance plans are hooked up with these guys. I know that my insurance plan in Guatemala uses them. However, even if you don't have insurance, if you dial their 4-number code, I think it's 1711, they'll arrive with the ambulance, paramedics, and sometimes even a doc right at your home within 10 or 15 minutes if you're living close or near to a city. In fact, not so long ago, a gringo friend of mine who didn't have healthcare insurance, he was just visiting for a while, he had to call him for a household emergency. A kid fell down. He thought he had a concussion. They showed up within 15 minutes with a doc on board. They did the whole emergency workup on the kid. Decided the kid didn't need to go to the hospital, but they waited around for about 45 minutes to make sure the kid was okay. Plus, they treated the wound, gave him some medicine, etc. And the cost? For a 3-man crew, 2 paramedics, and a doc? And remember, we're talking no insurance now, $125. So in the end, that's what I recommend you do if you're in Latin America, don't have insurance, maybe you're just down for a couple of weeks scouting things out. Jot that number down, 1711, just in case of an emergency or accident. By the way, for around $200 to $300 a year, you can buy an individual ambulance service plan. And though it might sound a little crazy, it's a great deal. For example, if you got your great-grandma living with you, or an elderly person at home who's, let's say, in a wheelchair, and has maybe a live-in nurse or a nurse that comes in once in a while to take care of her. Because, people in that age group, especially with this Cov-idiot thing, end up at the doc or the hospital fairly often. And, for example, if you happen to have the Alerta Medica ambulance plan, they allow you to have, I think it's 13 visits a year before they start charging you any extra fees. So for something like $200 or $300, your entire family can have up to 13 ambulance visits a year. How about that? So that's a great deal if you have someone in the house that's medically compromised. But if you're just the normal average person or family, you won't need that. But it's a great deal if you got someone who's medically compromised in the family. And here's the reasoning. If you come down here to Latin America and you drag your great-grandma or grandpa with you and he's stuck in a wheelchair or bedridden, whatever, and if he's over 65, it's going to be difficult for him or her to ever find private medical insurance. Though I believe just in the last couple of years, Banco Industrial, which has a great medical insurance plan, but you have to be a resident to qualify for a bank account and get on that plan. They have a number of plans, and last time I checked, they have one specifically for seniors. But that's really the oddball case. I don't know of any other insurance company that allows a person to enter the plan when you've reached 65 years of age. So that means if you're bringing great-grandma down, she's probably 70 or so, right? And though you should be buying that cheap insurance for yourself, grandma can't get on the plan. In that case, it would be a great deal for you to buy that Alerta Medica ambulance service plan, because chances are she'll be using it. Anyway, for everyone coming down to my Expat Insider Seminar, we're going to go over all that stuff in great detail. And for everyone else listening on the radio and the podcast, you'll hear me talk about this information like today in little dribs and drabs. Oh, and about those bomberos and bombero stations, fire stations. You'll see them around. When you drive by, you'll often see a shiny new fire truck and ambulance in there, often donated from some first world country. And sometimes you'll see a fire engine that looks like it's from the 50s or 60s, but always spit-shined and looking nice. In fact, there's one pretty big bombero station on the road from Guatemala City to El Salvador. It's called the Road to El Salvador. Carretera Salvador. In fact, it's pretty much right across the main superhighway from the biggest mall and shopping complex in all of Latin America, called Condado Concepcion. I drive past that fire station all the time, and once I pulled over, got out of the car just to look at one of the fire trucks. It was sitting out in front, and I recognized the brand, Peter Pierce. That just happened to be the fire truck company one of my uncles worked at, situated right across the Illinois border in Wisconsin, just north of Chicago. I don't know if it exists anymore, it probably doesn't, but when I was a kid, you know how kids love fire trucks, he gave me a tour of the place. So when I saw that old fire truck, I just got hit with a wave of nostalgia. What are the chances in Latin America I'd spot a fire truck that my uncle certainly worked on? Oh, and just to explain, this company, Peter Pierce, didn't make fire trucks. They would buy truck engines and frames from others, Ford, GMC, Mack Truck, and convert them into pumpers, hook and ladders, etc. but they'd slap their big chrome logo on it, Peter Pierce. When you're down here in Latin America long enough, coincidences do happen. Like, for example, the time I was in Honduras, driving to La Ceiba to go to Roatan. You know how on the back end or trunk of most all cars, there's the dealer sticker plate, you know, the place you bought it? Well, for about 50 miles or so, I was stuck behind a car that was purchased, according to the back bumper plate, at Paris Motors, a car dealer in North Chicago that since has gone out of business, where I actually bought 2 cars myself more than 30 years ago. Talk about coincidences, huh? But for me, the strangest coincidence of that sort happened to me when I was in Florence, Italy, some 20 or so years ago at midnight, walking across that famous bridge, the Ponte Vecchio. I was walking along in the dark and bumped into a guy who sat next to me in a couple of science lab classes in grad school. So how about you? How many crazy coincidences like that have you experienced whilst traveling? All right, now how about another email? This one's from Mr. Numero Uno. He says, "Good morning, Johnny." It's not morning for me. Anyway, he says, "I've been listening to your oldest podcast that started way back in November 2010. I'm up to your April 6, 2011 podcast now, where you mention a list of off-the-Gringo tourist trail cities, the best places to start a new business. Have you by any chance updated that 2011 list for 2020? As always, stay well and keep up the good work, Mr. Numero Uno." Wow, Mr. Numero Uno, you're digging way back 10 years ago now. And as far as having a list of off-the-Gringo trail cities where it's best to start a business for gringos and expats, I assume, well, the fact is there are just hundreds and hundreds of great little towns and cities off the tourist trail to get started with any kind of business. The thing is, once again, and what's most important, is to find a niche. That means boots on the ground. You've heard me say many times before on the show, it's so strange how so many gringos and expats down here in Latin America who've started businesses, they readily admit they had no idea they'd ever be doing such a thing when they were still back home in Detroit or Cleveland, thinking about making the move and what they'd be doing to make some money once they got there. Almost every gringo and expat in business I know found their particular niche once they got boots on the ground and saw things for themselves with eyes wide open. So my best business tip for you, Mr. Numero Uno, is to stay off or slightly off the Gringo tourist trail if you're thinking of a brick and mortar business. But if you're thinking of an internet business, you can do that anywhere. On or off the Gringo tourist trail, it won't make any difference. But you knew that already, right?
You've been listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America. If you need some help with your own Plan B, we can schedule a one-on-one phone or Skype consult. Just send me an email, theexpatfiles@gmail.com. And if you want to get on the waiting list for my next week-long Expat Insider Seminar in Central America, where you're guaranteed to get a 2 to 5 year head start on your Plan B, send me an email, theexpatfiles@gmail.com. Nos vemos.